Four anonymous Russian government sources has told Reuters in an exclusive report that Vladimir Putin wants a ceasefire deal permanently enshrining the current frontline positions, meaning that they would get to keep Crimea, they'd get to keep the city of Donetsk, and they'd get to keep new conquered territory that they've conquered since 2014, including the cities of Mariupol, Melitopol, and others. This would also, of course, imply millions upon millions of displaced Ukrainians who wouldn't be able to return to your home. The freezing of the conflict doesn't necessarily mean it would be the permanent end to the conflict, because this conflict has frozen before, and the Russians have a strategy of freezing wars and then reigniting them when it's politically convenient, like they did in 2022. And so there's a lot of question marks in the air, including the fact of, well, we don't really know if Vladimir Putin is being genuine or not. And I think that we have many reasons to suspect that he could very likely be not. But let's read a little bit from Reuters, the exclusive report, and what they're hearing from the four sources. And then let's talk about the likelihood of something like this happening, what exactly the Russian president's intentions could be for this stuff being communicated and it being allowed to be leaked, assuming that the reason that there's four separate sources is because the Russian president wanted it to be leaked. And considering what he said later to reporters, I highly suspect that this was purposely leaked by the Russian government in order to try to get a signal out to reporters, which would then be transferred to the media in response to the big Swiss peace summit that the Ukrainians are trying to have next month, trying to counter the narrative. Let's read a little bit into this. Russian President Vladimir Putin is ready to halt the war in Ukraine with a negotiated ceasefire that recognizes the current battlefield lines, four Russian sources told Reuters, saying he's prepared to fight on if Kiev and the West do not respond. Three of the sources, familiar with discussions in Putin's entourage, said the veteran Russian leader had expressed frustrations to a small group of advisors about what he views as Western-backed attempts to stymie negotiations and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's decision to rule out talks. Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire to freeze the war, said another of the four, a senior Russian source who has worked with Putin and has knowledge of top-level conversations in the Kremlin. He, like the other cited in the story, spoke on the condition of anonymity given the matter's sensitivity. For this account, Reuters spoke to a total of 5 people who work with or have worked with Putin at the senior level in the political and business worlds. The fifth source did not comment on the freezing of the war at the current front lines. Asked about the Reuters report at a news conference in Belarus on Friday, Putin said peace talks should restart. Let them resume, he said, adding that negotiations should be based, and this is important, on the realities on the ground and on a plan agreed to during a previous attempt to reach a deal in the first weeks of the war, not on the basis of what one side once. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said on X that the Russian leader was trying to derail a Ukrainian-initiated peace summit in Switzerland next month by using his entourage to send out phony signals about his alleged readiness to halt the war. Now, there's more to the article. It's an exclusive Reuters report, so they wanted to juice these sources for as much as they could, and they have some other commentary and some background knowledge. But that's the big story here, is that the Russian government probably leaked, or maybe it was a genuine leak that didn't mean to get out, but considering Vladimir Putin's response shortly after, I do think that this was probably purposely leaked by the Russian government with a signal that they are willing to have a ceasefire talk in order to freeze the current front lines. Now, let's be clear. The freezing of the current front lines is non-negotiable, meaning that for the Russians and from Putin's perspective, according to these sources, and this is all based on anonymous sources that we don't know, so it depends on your opinion of Reuters, and I think Reuters is credible enough. I know others disdain Reuters or disdain certain reporters that have worked for Reuters, but I think a lot of times it's just the deliverer of truth is treated very bitterly. You know, the message of don't shoot the messenger, and I think sometimes a lot of these media companies in the pro-Ukraine sphere get treated that way, particularly like, for example, Christopher Miller when he reported on stuff like Zelensky being removed, and nobody wanted to believe it, and so they started trying to go after Christopher Miller's reputation to try to tear down the idea that the idea of Zelensky, the popular general, being fired is not true. So it would depend on your respect of Reuters and the respect of the anonymous officials that we don't know of. And it depends upon whether you think this was a purposeful leak, which I do, or it doesn't, like it isn't a purposeful leak. All depends on, this all determines how you think. Wait 1 second, I'm distracted by something on my screen. Give me a moment. Point is, they're anonymous officials, so we don't know who they are, and so a lot of this is, a lot of the credibility of this depends upon how you view Reuters and how you view specifically Putin's intentions and whether he was leaking this purposely, which I do, or he doesn't. But this is the signal that's been sent out. This is the signal that Putin has now responded to, and it is all based upon the idea of either A, Putin is now believing that, as the sources say in this article, that he wants to put the war behind them, behind himself, behind his country, and he just wants to sell a victory to the people to put this behind him. B, that this is a tactic to take away from the Ukrainian peace summit in Switzerland, and, you know, there's not really much to it whatsoever. Or C, he merely wants to freeze the war and then continue the war later after having frozen it and then reigniting it 2-3 years down the line after they have gone through another wave of, you know, mobilization or militarization. It all depends on how you see their intentions. Of course, I would be the first person to go out there and say that if you were to listen to that word that Putin said, like based upon previously agreed formats, is the language that he's using in response to the question by the journalist, I assume that he's talking about the Turkish format, when Ukrainian and Russian officials had discussions in Istanbul and they started having some version of a preliminary agreement. But when we say preliminary agreement, that doesn't mean they've agreed on everything, simply that they've started moving towards a general framework of what a peace or what a ceasefire or what something to negotiate on might look like, but no formal like approval or anything had occurred. In fact, at the meeting in Istanbul, there was not even Ukrainian officials that were high-ranking enough to give that type of formal approval. But if that is the case, that he wants to base it in the Istanbul talks, which broke down and didn't really develop anything early on in the war, then not only would he be trying to take the land that they currently have, which would be cementing these gains so they can either keep them or build upon them later, which is a real concern of mine, but also it would mean restrictions on the Ukrainian military. Because a big sticking point, in fact, the biggest sticking point as to why those talks failed, as to why they didn't bring about peace. Of course, it could be A, that the Russians never wanted peace and it was just a delaying tactic as the war started to go awry, and this was just a way to kind of keep off Western response and Western aid, so the West thought maybe they could settle a deal so they wouldn't have to send weapons over. You could look at it like that, but assuming that they were actually negotiating, assuming that the Russians would actually be willing to accept the deals that were being proposed, they were asking for the Ukrainian army to be restricted to 75,000 troops. And there would be limits on tank amounts, limits on artillery guns. Now, considering that the Ukrainian army was the size of 250,000 at the start of the war, and now is the size of like 800,000 to 1 million soldiers, and they're still getting slowly pushed back in some areas like Vovchansk, even though that area is generally stabilized, or around Chasiv Yar or Robatny or other locations. So if it's not only capturing the land that they could build upon later, dependent upon there being no security guarantees to Ukraine, if the West would fail in implementing that or Putin would be able to stop something like that from happening, it would mean a terrible tragedy, of course, for any of the Ukrainians that are trying to return home, who would now be unable to return home. But on top of everything else, that we're not hearing anything about long-term security guarantees. We think that they're probably going to be able to keep, or they would almost certainly be able to keep the land and might build upon it later if the war is kicked down the road. But also, if it is true that it's based in that format, then it would also mean that Putin could possibly still be demanding that Ukraine demilitarize, which might seem like a wild demand to make of a country you just invaded and you failed in taking over and are now trying to get whatever you can from them if you cannot get them to collapse, which I still think if the Russians can achieve, they will go for it. But asking them to put down their gun after you tried to murder them is not, it's not very convincing to the party on the receiving end. So if that is still being included in Putin's ceasefire talks, if that is a restriction that they still want to place on the Ukrainians, then there's no chance the Ukrainians will accept it. I don't think it's likely the Ukrainians will accept it because the Russians say that they want to keep all the territory. The Ukrainians are pretty steadfast of ejecting them from that territory. I don't think they'd want to accept it because the Russian president explicitly said he doesn't want to negotiate with Zelensky. He wants to negotiate with what he called, and I quote, the collective West, which means he wants to speak over the heads of the people that would actually have to live in the country that he's slicing up. But also, if he wants to place restrictions on how the Ukrainians can defend themselves, then we could very well have agreed to a proposal like this, set the Ukrainians up for an even worse scenario a few years down the line if they don't even have the 250,000 troops that they had at the start of this war to both either dissuade a Russian invasion or beat back a Russian invasion if they move on to try to conquer Russian-speaking cities like Kharkiv or Russian-speaking cities like Odessa or Zaporizhia that they still want to conquer, that they have still expressed open interest in conquering and are currently invading again, like in the Kharkiv area, in the Kharkiv Oblast. And I do want to point that, putting all of the this suggestion aside from Vladimir Putin, that there is some other stuff that he indicated, I think, through symbolism while in Belarus recently that should be taken into consideration. For example, Ukraine's former pro-Russian leader, Viktor Yanukovych, showed up in Belarus to meet Putin during this meeting that he had with Lukashenko and gang. Why is Viktor Yanukovych, the former leader of Ukraine, who was expelled back in 2014, well, actually fled back in 2014 after the Euromaidan movement, who hasn't shown his face since the start of the invasion, when many people were speculating that he was in Belarus to take over in Kiev after the Ukrainian government would be ejected and exiled by Russian troops. He's now all of a sudden popped his head out again 2 years later, and he's now doing public meetings with Vladimir Putin and gang. Why? What does that seem to indicate? Well, Vladimir Putin at the same event was also saying that President Zelensky was an illegitimate president. Now, he based this off of two things. The first thing is the fact that Viktor Yanukovych is the real president. It's that Yanukovych was couped in 2014. Now, Yanukovych brutally suppressed his own people, helped kill over 100 protesters, hired armed gangs to go beat them down, tried to ban protesting. And when the situation got out of control because the people were unhappy and the protests exploded, he fled the country. And then the Ukrainian parliament, the Ukrainian Rada, filled the vacancy until new elections could be held. So as of Petro Poroshenko being elected, they've had a democratically elected Ukrainian president. And then Zelensky was elected as well. But now it's based not only in that claim, Putin is all basing it in another claim as well, in that Zelensky's term, if there was to be elections and the cycle of the elections in Ukraine was the same as usual, then there should have been another Ukrainian election. And Zelensky's term should have ended like about a few weeks ago. So from his perspective, he's saying, or at least from his propaganda view, whatever you want to call it, he's saying that not only is it illegitimate because Viktor Yanukovych is the real president, but also is illegitimate because President Zelensky isn't even within his own term. But if you know about the Ukrainian constitution, it does give powers for the Ukrainian government to delay elections in wartime, national shutdown, getting invaded scenarios, which the Ukrainian government, putting the country on, on emergency mode, is allowed to delay it until the war is over, much like the United Kingdom did during the Second World War.
Corrupt, bankrupt.
But that's his basis. That's his legal ex-moral basis for saying that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is illegitimate. Now, if Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is illegitimate, then that can justify them speaking over the head of Zelensky and not including the Ukrainians at the negotiating table to discuss the future of their own country. And so the American government's already responded to this and said, like, to be clear, there is no scenario where we're just going to box the Ukrainians out. To make a long story short, they said the Russians could stop the war anytime they want in the near future by just leaving. They're free to do that. But at the end of the day, they should restore Ukrainian territorial sovereignty, and they have to negotiate with the Ukrainians. So it's already a non-starter for the American government, but it's a non-starter on many levels. It's a non-starter for the Ukrainian government because they want their land back. Now, whether the West would make that a hard rule or not is more debated, but that's something that they want. And even if they would be willing to make a deal on some land, to make a deal on all of the land, like Mariupol and Metsiopol and many locations where there's no evidence of even significant pro-Russian sentiment in the cities to ever necessitate it being taken over by the Russians. Not saying that existed in other locations taken over, just saying that it would be very unpopular with many of the residents who have since been expelled or have fled the city. And then we would have millions of people permanently displaced who'd be unable to return to their homes, on top of the millions who were displaced in 2014, creating a very large displaced population, making it very, very negative for the Ukrainian government, who are going to have to find a new existence for these people if they ever return to Ukraine, with many of them seemingly going to look for applying for citizenship in other countries if they cannot return to their own country, leading to an intensification of the demographic crisis that Ukraine is facing, as well as the loss of 80% of its coastline. So that's something that for the Ukrainians, for the people that want to return to their homes, for the loss of 80% of their coastline, for the fact that the Russians could very well just start another war in a few years, and not only have they given up Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, now they've given up even more, and now they've got to fight the war again with even less of a country, with all those resources and people absorbed into the Russian war machine, because we've seen how Russian mobilization is in occupied territory. For on that level, it's not really going to vibe with the Ukrainian government. But it's not only on that level that it's not going to vibe with the Ukrainian government, but they feel like they have to be included at the table. So speaking over their heads is not going to vibe well with the Ukrainian government. But not only that is not going to vibe well, but if they're still basing it in the Istanbul format and not on the Swiss format from the Swiss Peace Summit, or is requesting things like the demilitarization of Ukraine, which would be, if the Ukrainians agreed to it, the equivalent of delayed national suicide, then that's also not going to be something that the Ukrainians can accept. So from the Ukrainian perspective, this offer, even if it was legit, which we don't know, it could just be a way to create PR noise against the Swiss Peace Summit, which is next month. It does seem somewhat, and I don't know for sure, again, because I don't know who the anonymous sources are from Reuters, so I cannot say this for sure. It does seem semi-choreographed. I mean, it does a little bit considering how Putin's responding. From the American perspective, there's a good chance that they would feel, from the Biden perspective, like, hey, maybe if we were to sign this deal now, it could avoid potential escalation. So that would probably be pleasing to people like Jake Sullivan. But if there's a demilitarized Ukraine, that's a weaker barrier between Russia and the rest of NATO. It also means if Ukraine is to join NATO, it would be a weaker state. The issue of Ukraine joining NATO, which the United States has committed to basically be in Ukraine's future, would be a question that is still currently unanswered, and that would have to be talked out in talks. And we don't know if Putin would be willing to agree to anything that would see Ukraine's long-term security agreed to, especially if he wants to build upon these gains in the future, which would not surprise anyone considering Putin's track record online about his intentions before doing the exact opposite of what he said he wouldn't do. The American government would also probably not be too, I think, excited about the idea of having to fix all or be at all held responsible for negotiating on behalf of the Ukrainians, especially after there was so much critique for the Trump administration. Now, this could be a Biden administration specific complaint, maybe not as much for the Trump administration, but after what happened in Afghanistan, after the ANA and the Afghans were negotiated over by the Trump administration, which many people see as one of the key mistakes behind the failure of the negotiating tactics used by the West, specifically the United States, when negotiating with the Taliban, I don't think the Biden administration wants to repeat that. And I think there is a simple logic to the idea that those who live in the country should have a say in how the future of that country goes, because I think they probably have a better understanding of what's going to keep Ukraine stable than somebody in, say, Washington, D.C. So from the American perspective, even if you were to accept this as 100% legitimate and not just signaling by Putin, there's some things that are objectionable. It's very objectionable to the Ukrainians. Now, what about the Russian perspective? Let's talk about the Russian perspective. Now, if they were to succeed, let's assume that Biden and Zelensky would sit down and actually well, not Zelensky, it would just be Biden and other Western leaders, apparently, because that's how the Russians want to do it. But that they would box out Zelensky and they'd sit down and they would actually get something resembling this. What would be the benefits for the Russians? What would be the negatives? Well, as much as we hear from Ukrainian politicians and Ukrainian leadership that any a freeze of the war would benefit the Russians and just give them time to rearm and keep pushing, that is also a critique of freezing the war by a lot of hardcore Russian nationalists. You could probably point to people like Igor Girkin, who are currently incarcerated, or other Russian-type nationalists who are not going to be very happy with that, even if others in Ukraine, in Russian society, the wider public, would be more happy with that. But even though there would be a certain public that would not be happy with a part of the public, the really nationalist types who would be unhappy, the majority of the Russian public would probably be happy, which is a positive for the Putin regime, since the majority of the Russian public are either apathetic or they're hopeful about or wanting the war to end in the near future. So that would be a benefit. And even when we talk about that one negative, that'd be a benefit to the Russians. What else would be a benefit? Well, you would see the end of Russia grinding down its tank reserves. You would see the end of the Russians grinding down its manpower. You would see Vladimir Putin not have to engage in another wave of mobilization, which even this article says that the sources in it say that Putin doesn't really want this war to go on, and he wants to, quote unquote, put it behind him if he can, in large part because he saw during the first wave of mobilization how his popularity legitimately, even by Russian pollsters, considering the pressures on Russians to answer in certain ways to pollsters, considering how their political freedom of expression culture is, there was a notable drop in support. And that's something that worries Putin, which is why that they, instead of doing another wave of mobilization, they've done either shadow mobilization, which means blocking up loopholes to try to grab more Russians, or they've increased the benefits and contracts and relied on recruiting foreigners, Cubans, people from different African countries. I've seen Chinese soldiers. We're going to be reacting to a Chinese soldier's interview that he did after, well, testimony that he gave after serving in the Russian army, where he said, "I thought it'd be a cakewalk." Guess what? It wasn't. Point is, though, that the Russians don't want to get back to that point of a second mobilization. They don't want to get to that point. If Putin can avoid it, he can. Freezing it here would be another benefit. There would also be a benefit domestically, as he could turn to the Russian public and say, "We won. We won, guys. Look," and that maybe this isn't everything, originally we were going for, but psych, we originally just wanted this. And he could try to sell it. And the sources in this article suggest that Putin could try to sell this as some sort of victory, and that they had, quote unquote, beaten off the West. But also, that doesn't suggest to me that even if they were to have less land coming out of this war than they do have currently, that they still couldn't make the claim that we've destroyed all of NATO's reserves. Or, I mean, if he wanted to just do a propaganda fiesta, I don't understand why he couldn't outside of that as well. But of course, a big benefit for the Russians, which I think is the most obvious benefit of the Russians, is that they've moved the border forward, taken a bunch of land, and so if they can enshrine this, then they can not only enshrine Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, which is not internationally recognized, but the taking of more territory, the development of a land bridge to Crimea, making Crimea and its control by the Russians more secure, as well as building up a possible future starting point for future aggression, dependent upon there being no long-term security guarantees from the West, if Putin could accomplish that in negotiations, which would probably be, in my estimation, the worst case scenario. If there was any talk where Putin got all the land that he holds now, and then he got a ceasefire with no long-term security guarantees for Ukraine. To me, I could just see every single ingredient for another war, the third wave of this war, starting just a few years down the line, just dangling so close to each other that would be enough to put the hairs on my neck up. It's terrifying me. So, to put it lightly, I am not very hopeful about the prospects for peace in the near future. While it could benefit the Russian perspective to try to achieve this with the West, if they wanted to continue to push in future offensives, give some time to rearm. And there are negatives when it comes to the Russian nationalists. There are negatives when it comes to the fact that the Ukrainians are going to be able to rearm too. But the Russians, if they were able to achieve it on the original Istanbul framework, could very well set themselves up for the future well. So I don't think it's impossible that Putin wouldn't accept something like this at this point, but I think that's because those terms would amazingly benefit the Russians and set them up for future successes. So if we were to accept purely the Istanbul framework after they had taken all this land, then we would be accepting the framework that was meant to stop them from invading and take the land that they've taken. So they get the rewards from Ukraine of demilitarization that would have been the reward for them not invading in exchange for them taking more land from them. The Russians taking more land from Ukraine. It doesn't make much sense, but I think that's why I'm not completely putting off the idea that Putin might actually be willing to accept these terms. But on the other hand, I think Putin very much still wants Kharkiv. I think he very much still wants Odessa. I think if he could, he'd still replace Zelensky with Viktor Yanukovych. Why is he calling Zelensky legitimate? Because he doesn't respect the Ukrainian body politic and he wants to crush it, replace it, or absorb it. And so I don't think those goals have changed. And so I still think that Putin might very well want to continue to push forward the war to achieve these goals, but whether he wants to have a pause and then push it later because that'd be more convenient, or just keep trudging along now to give the Ukrainians no time to rest, the same way the Ukrainians talk about not giving the Russians time to rest, I cannot tell you. Now, from the Ukrainian perspective, I don't see them accepting this deal at all. Number one, the Ukrainians think it's mandatory for them to be at the table. Number two, they don't want to give up the land. Number three, they don't want to accept any restriction on their military, demilitarization or anything like that, considering if there's any country that can justify the existence of their armed forces, I think Ukraine is near the top of the list. There's just so much involved in this that makes it basically bleh. It makes it an impossible goal to achieve in the short term, at least in my mind, or near impossible, because you're not going to convince the Ukrainians. It's not, I think, a lot in America's interest necessarily to accept this right now if its aid is coming to the battlefield and they could blunt the Russian attack if that aid gets there on time, if mobilization goes well, putting the Ukrainians in either a better negotiating position in the future, or maybe it would be good enough that they could actually be at the table to negotiate, or the fact that, again, if it's on the Istanbul framework, NATO would be agreeing for Ukraine to demilitarize after the Russians have shown that they wanted to aggress upon them twice and are showing aggression towards NATO in other areas, like in Estonia, like with the destruction of the border barriers over the river between Estonia and Russia, whether it was the Russian Defense Ministry posting statements about reanalyzing the border between Russia and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania when it comes to their territorial waters, which are already internationally recognized. Whether it has to do with the acts of sabotage in Germany, the acts of sabotage in Poland, including the bombings, the arson attacks, whether it has to do with the poisonings, whether it has to do with the attack of infrastructure in Czechia, the arson attacks in the United Kingdom, whether it has to do with their threats to seize assets, just like we've threatened to seize assets. I don't think this has a chance of success. I do think there's one factoid I want to leave us with here, and that is that one of the people who spoke, one of the Russian sources that are within the Russian government, did talk about how Vladimir Putin was not only not happy with the idea of doing another wave of mobilization, but there was a concern that a bunch of dissatisfied soldiers coming back. Now, I think this is a concern expressed by the individual, not necessarily Putin, but this is an individual that works within the Russian inner circle, that dissatisfied veterans coming back from the war that has been going on for years to find their post-war economic prospects not that booming could increase dissatisfaction with the government. And the longer that bleeding goes on, the more dissatisfied veterans you could have, and the longer you have to invest capital into the war instead of trying to satisfy those people, and the bigger the cost is going to be from these big contracts that are being promised to soldiers, the bigger the burden on the state can become, a state that's already burdened in many different areas. That, again, that's one of many reasons that's suggesting to me that this could be a semi-legitimate offer, but it's also a semi-legitimate offer made from a position of, if this agreement was agreed to on the Russian terms as they're discussing, well, that could just be another checkpoint in a long campaign to continue to subvert Ukrainian sovereignty. It would just be, oh, there was the invasion in 2014, there was an invasion in 2022, and then there was another invasion in 2028 after the 2025 peace process. So I don't think it's impossible that this isn't legit, even though I think it could also very much just be signaling. But also, if it's on the Istanbul format, they get to keep the land and there's no long-term guarantees for Ukrainian security, which isn't discussed here. That issue is not discussed here. This is not a framework for long-term stability. This is a framework for setting up the next conflict. And that way, that's why I hope that when they do sit down and they do have a discussion, the Ukrainians are at the table. The future of this land is not just unilaterally decided by the Russians, and we can make a peace that is stable in the long term and would dissuade anyone from ever stomping their soldiers into Ukraine again. Okay, Good talk. Oh, and here's Victor Medvedchuk releasing a parallel interview during the Putin speeches, claiming that Russia will only get a peace process from the collective West. So I said that was Putin. That wasn't Putin. That was Victor Medvedchuk. That's one thing I got wrong. But Victor Medvedchuk is a close Putin ally that was a Ukrainian politician that was exchanged to the Russians during a prisoner swap in exchange for 250 soldiers from Mariupol. Oh, also, there is one other thing that I do need to bring up that does make me more skeptical, because again, I'm divided on how legit this offer is, even if it's legit only on pro-Russian terms.
Corrupt, bankrupt man.
Is that Putin was asked about a potential ceasefire around the Olympics for a month by President Macron, with some tradition attached to it, because the Olympics is supposed to be countries coming together, and Putin flat out rejected it. So to me, that signals one of two things. Either A, that kind of points towards this earlier peace signaling or ceasefire signaling being nothing more than just flashy lights and a distracting noise, or it could indicate that they would only accept a ceasefire based on the Istanbul process that was being discussed earlier in the war, based on terms that the Russians would find suitable and that the Ukrainians would find very, very unsuitable, which points towards the idea that the Russians certainly considered themselves to be the one with the immense leverage in the situation, either because, as the article suggests, A, Putin doesn't think that Western support will hold out, or B, a delusion. Whichever one you want to choose and point towards. I'm still nervous about Western support being stable, so I wouldn't lean too hard into delusion. I will speak for the West. Hey, can we get some volunteers to go speak for the collective West to negotiate with Putin? Who wants to volunteer?